Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is a presentation about Android and Xojo. I am happy to give this because I'm happy to be working on the project. This is a bit of an interesting presentation because I've wanted to have parts in here that apply to those who have been helping us test Android for a while, as well as for those who haven't tried it yet. So bear with me because I'm sure some parts will interest you more than others. So what we'll walk through today is I'll do a quick status update about where we're at. Those of you who have been testing have a fairly good idea, but those who haven't, I want to get everyone on the same page. Then next, I'll quickly show a little video demo of building an app in Android to show how it's done. And then sharing code across the different platforms, because obviously we're Xojo, so we have desktop, iOS, web, and soon Android. And then jump under the hood a bit, because a lot of the questions I sometimes get a bit technical, and so I want to run through some of that for you, for those who are interested. And then the topic that we get probably the most is, what are our plans to release this? Please, please release Android, so we'll talk about that too. So as a status update, as we've said a couple times already today, we have hundreds of automated internal tests. We run these extensive tests all the time as we've been working on building out our Android support. And yes, someone was joking with me. So you said you had hundreds of tests in the keynote. How many of them pass? Well, yes, almost all the tests pass almost all the time, and the point is to catch regressions quickly. And so hopefully if you have been testing with us this year, you've noticed that as things get fixed in the Android test builds, they usually, generally, stay fixed. And UI components. We have more than 30 UI-related controls that are supported now. As you can see from up here, this includes buttons, canvases, HTML viewer, labels, and more. All of the most common ones are available and working. And just continuing with UI, all the controls, you drag and drop them in, and Android uses control locking, and their positions, widths, heights are all changeable in code, just like you see on the desktop. And this table lists some of the common framework classes that are available to Android projects now. But there are actually even more than this. I mean, we've got system, device, and version data, global methods to handle URL, base64, hex encoding, and decoding. All told, there are more than 40, 45 framework classes available. Simply put, in general, most of the Xojo framework is supported now, and of course with more on the way after the initial release. And as far as examples are concerned, we now have 50 Android example projects. We had 49, so I added one, just like we were getting to an even number. So we're now at 50, covering a wide variety of framework functionality and application types to really help people hit the ground running. And so what are we working on right now? Well, we have been fixing a lot of bugs, and you'll see even more of that after the retreat, after we're back. And another key thing that we're working on is projects that take a little too long to run or build. We want to cut that down before we ship out to a wider audience. So when you're building an Android app, even though Android is, as a platform, fairly unique in many ways, we want all Xojo developers to feel right at home with it. So just like building for other platforms, you use the same language, same framework stuff that you're used to. As I mentioned earlier, it uses control locking for layout, and it allows you to change the position of your controls wherever you need more flexibility. So bottom line, drag and drop controls, add code, and go. Just the Xojo experience on another platform. So like I said, I know that there's many of you who have already been testing Android, but some here and who are at home watching this haven't. So I'm just going to show a really quick demo building a very simple example. Okay, so what this is doing, it's just grabbing a button and it's grabbing a label, just putting that label right below the button, going to expand that out. And then I'm going to go ahead and go into the pressed event, put some code in there. And the code that I'm going to put in there, I'm going to make a variable that I call my version is string. And I'm going to use that very system version class that I talked about, just called toString on it to get the string value. And then in a message box, I'm going to say I am running my version, which should tell me what version of Android this is running on. And then I'm going to go ahead and say label1.text equals datetime.now toString. So whenever this was made, it should give that timestamp. So click run. Got the Android emulator on the side. It's waiting for the debugger to connect, and we'll talk about a bit more about debugging in a bit. And now the debugger is actually launching the app. And there it is with the button and the label. I click the button. And sure enough, it tells me that this emulator happens to be running Android 11, and this was running a few days ago, September 15th. So really simple and easy, just like every other platform available in Xojo. So now I want to talk a little bit about sharing code. So as those of you who have been testing this know, the first release of Android has its own separate project type. So why is that? Why have we done that? One of the main reasons is that as of right now, iOS projects use auto layout, while Android projects use control locking and actually let you change the position of controls directly in code. But this is actually a temporary scenario. We have plans to make one mobile project type in the future, just like you see with desktop, that can then go to iOS and Android. And the way that will happen is we are actually going to enable, this has been a request for a while, control locking and direct control of your controls on iOS without having to use auto layout. And that does have to happen before we can bring the project types together. So even though we have separate project types right now, you have access to most of the same controls, framework, and thus code as other projects. So let's take a quick look at what this looks like. This demo here, for those who have already been testing, will be something you've seen plenty of. But if you haven't had this kind of experience, this is really, really cool because I'm starting with a desktop app. I'm doing a button, I'm doing a label, similar to what I did earlier. And then I'm going to go ahead and into this button. When it's pressed, I'm going to put in some code. Now, this code that just got pasted in, which is pre-written, actually does several things. It looks for a SQLite database to see if it exists. If it does, it deletes it so it can make a new one. It creates a SQLite table. It inserts a value, and that value is Travis. And then it selects from that table to get that value and tells you what it got. So it's actually doing a lot of things. It's using iterators, for loops, variables, and hey, you get the name is Travis. That's my name. It worked. So that's on the desktop side. So going to close that. And then I'm going to make a new project. This one, I'm just going down the list here. So now I'm doing web. Going to do the same thing. Going to grab a button, grab a label, make the label long enough so you can read it. Then I'm going to go into the button, into the event. And I'm not changing a single letter of all of this code with its iterator, data access, file access, everything. And I'm just going to hit run. And so this is what was on the desktop, now on the web. And lo and behold, I hit the button. It's created a SQLite database, inserted data, selected data, and says the name is Travis. So there's not much suspense here. Can you guess what's coming next? iOS. What? Oh, yeah, I skipped console because it doesn't have GUI controls. But I could have done something similar in console. You're right. But in iOS, doing the same thing. In the event, the exact same letter-for-letter code. Hitting run. It's going to go ahead and compile it, and then it's going to start the iOS simulator. So that's going to load up, hit the button, boom, does all the same steps. Created the database, created the table, created the record, read the record. And now for the thrilling conclusion. You know, this demo might seem kind of boring, but it's actually pretty exciting in how simple it is to take exactly the same code across all of these platforms. This is a very rare thing, and one of the things that makes me really excited about Xojo. So I've done the same thing. Label, button, pasted exactly the same code. Hit run. So it's now compiling my Android app, waiting for the debugger to connect. The debugger is now launching. The debugger has connected. Now it's going to start up the app in just a second. And there it is. I hit the button, and it's done all the same operations. Name is Travis. So that is really our goal, and you've been with Xojo long enough to know that's our goal on every platform we support. Make it very easy to move between them and share code. Okay, so let's pop the hood and talk about what's going on inside with Android. So we do consider some of the things that I'm going to talk about today as implementation details. And what we mean by that is they are subject to change. As William mentioned, sometimes we'll find a new library or a new approach to something, and we might change the way that's done, but usually we do it in a way that doesn't impact you and your code. So our Android support consists of both new compilation and debugging pieces. We'll talk about what those are and why we've taken the time to do them. The goal, of course, is that even though these are new systems that we had to build, they don't require you as a Xojo developer to do anything differently. And our current device target is Android 7 and higher, which represents, according to Google, 92.7% of in-use devices. So just like any platform, there's always a balance to strike in supported versions versus the effort required. And with Android 7 hitting more than 90%, we're pretty happy with where we're at on that point. So with compilation, don't you already have an ARM compiler? That's the question we get asked. Well, yes, we do, and it's used all over the place on Linux, iOS, macOS, and now recently Windows. But compilation with Android takes a different approach. We've built a transpiler that compiles Xojo code to Kotlin code. So why would we do that when we have that ARM compiler that we just talked about? Well, there's a few reasons, and I'm going to walk through them now. So Google recommends a bytecode approach for most apps. As Paul mentioned earlier, it's this art bytecode. Particularly business apps which use a lot of OS controls and OS frameworks, which are actually the most popular types of apps built with Xojo. And while Java itself is still supported to build that bytecode, Kotlin is the recommended language from Google going forward to do so. And why does Google make this recommendation that most of your apps should be done with this bytecode instead of necessarily a particular CPU architecture? Well, there are a few reasons why. So with Android, it's fairly unique in the sense that OS calls and OS controls live in this bytecode kind of virtual world. That is, when you use them from pre-built native code, it requires you to go across a thing called the JNI bridge. And so this is something we encountered with an earlier approach we took to Android, where we actually used our existing ARM compiler, and we built a native blob that went in, and then we had our bytecode that just called stuff inside of this native blob. But what we realized was that, like I said, the most common apps built in Xojo are business apps that are using OS calls and OS controls. So we were having to go back and forth over this JNI bridge a lot, which caused compatibility issues, caused performance issues on some older devices, and we didn't want to have to live with those kind of compromises. So another reason is, unlike something like iOS, which is now exclusively ARM64, even newer devices today sometimes ship using a 32-bit Android kernel. And you may not believe me, but I can show you a phone from just 6 months ago. When you go to About, it has a 64-bit chip in it, but it's running the 32-bit Android kernel, which thus means you're running 32-bit code on that device. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So not only do we have to deal with that, but there are Android platforms that aren't just ARM, of course. Usually there's ARM 32-bit, ARM 64-bit, and x86 32-bit and 64-bit. But when you're building Android code, one of the things we set out to do was to make it very similar to how you would do, say, Mac OS or iOS code, which is integers are 64-bit. You treat it just the same way as if you're coding for a 64-bit platform. But because of the way we've built this, it'll just work no matter what you're running on. We'll talk about some of the places your apps can actually run. So the other advantage, of course, and why this is recommended, is that there aren't ABI, which is application binary interface changes to deal with in user code across the different architectures when you use this bytecode. And finally, there are likely significant kernel and runtime changes in Android's future. Well, what do I mean by this? Now, like Apple, Google holds some cards fairly close to the vest, but if you've been reading the tea leaves like we've had, you've heard and seen some of their new devices shipping with what they call the Fuchsia operating system and kernel, and it's a very different kernel than the Linux-based one that currently ships in Android. And they've been giving hints through the years that Android will indeed one day move to that. I can't tell you if and when that's going to happen, but given the hints and what that change would mean, because we've looked at Fuchsia, when we take this bytecode approach, all of your apps will immediately run fully supported at full speed, even if something as drastic as the base kernel changes inside of Android. So it's another reason to take this approach. And so, as I mentioned, if those changes come about, when they come about, Xojo apps won't have to be rebuilt to still be first-class citizens on Android. So, our initial release of Android support is indeed focused on phones, which are by far the most popular device type. When you look at the device type graph, they support all kinds of things, TVs and such, but phones is by far the most popular, and that's what we're aiming to support in our initial release. But because we've taken the time to build this transpiler and go to their supported bytecode, Xojo-built Android apps are technically capable on running on much more than phones. And I've actually tested these, which was both fun and frustrating at the same time. But indeed, there is Android and Google TV. Those two terms actually do refer to different software running on different devices, but at the end of the day, they're running Android in the back end. It's the interface that changes, but Xojo apps run fine on either. Chromebooks now have official support, at least the modern Chromebooks do, for Android apps, and Xojo-built apps run on them as well. And Windows 11 now has a subsystem for Android. In fact, the way you get the subsystem is actually if you are a Windows insider and you search for the, I believe it's the Amazon App Store, is how you initially get the subsystem for Android. And once you have that installed, you can run Xojo-built Android apps straight on Windows 11. Now, why you would do that? Well, that's a fun intellectual conversation because you can make a great native Windows app using Xojo today. But you can do it. So if you want to, hey, be my guest. And handheld gaming devices. This is kind of interesting because there's been this market lately of cheap $50 to $100 little devices with game pads that I've got in this screenshot here that run Android. Well, our apps run on that too. And in fact, that inspired me to start working on kind of a game type example. We'll see if that makes the initial release, but it's kind of fun that these cheap little Android devices can indeed run Xojo apps. And of course, Fire OS, which is Amazon's name for their branch of Android, that's what powers their Kindle tablets and devices. So not their e-readers. I'm talking about the Kindle Fire series, which is tablets. It also includes the Fire TV series that can plug into your TV. Xojo-built apps work on those as well. So, LLVM itself does not have an Android Java bytecode backend. So this is why once we decided we wanted these advantages and to follow Google's recommendations, we can't use our current setup, which works great everywhere else, to generate this bytecode because it simply does not have a backend for it. So, as I've been talking, we want all the code and platform advantages that I've just talked about in following their rules with this bytecode approach. So, to make all of that happen, we've taken the jump to make a new transcompiler that goes in the backend from Xojo code to Kotlin code. But again, you don't have to think about the Kotlin code or even know it exists. Our job is to make sure that you don't have to know that. And I just want to answer this and be very clear. This does produce native apps on devices. So even though it is Art bytecode, when you install that app on any of these Android devices, it is converted to native code. You are running according to the platform guidelines, and in fact, you are running natively on 32 or 64-bit ARM or x86, or there have even been MIPS Android devices. It will work. And, okay, so moving on from compilation over to debugging. So we have built this debugging bridge, and Paul's here. Paul can say hi. He's done a lot of the work on the debugging bridge. What this does is it translates our Xojo IDE messaging over to the Android virtual debugging messages. So they have a defined debugging protocol, just like we have a defined debugging protocol. And this bridge just sits between them and translates the messages so they understand each other. And it supports all the common things like breakpoints, viewing values, etc. And of course, just like the compilation process, our goal with that debugging bridge is that debugging Android works for you just like debugging any other app. It doesn't matter that it happens to be bytecode instead of CPU architecture specific code. It just works the same way. So just like the new compilation process, making this new debugger bridge and this new debugging process has certainly been a journey, and we've been fixing bugs, still have more to fix, but we're working away at it. So release plans. One of the more popular questions. As we've also mentioned today, we consider ourselves feature complete for the initial release of Android. Now, that doesn't mean that Android has everything under the sun or matches perfectly with everything that's available in every other single platform, but It does have most of the framework, even if it might not have something like regex in V1. You can be sure that as you see in us keeping working on this in the future, that it's going to have more and more of that functionality. But we have to draw the line somewhere. And right now, you can't really build any Android app with Xojo, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with what we've already done so far. So we really want to ship that out to a wider audience soon. And how far along are we? Well, there are actually already some apps on the Play Store. Not only did we put, I believe, Cats up on the store, but we've seen some apps from the Xojo community show up on the Play Store. Even once when I told this person, they asked me, so is this good enough for me to put on the Play Store? I said, well, you know, we don't generally recommend that with pre-release. It's like, well, it's working for me, so I'm going to do it. Okay. And sure enough, I mean, it's really cool to see that some are already making it, even though we are still in our pre-release testing phase. And we understand, I mean, we know how much people want this. We really do, and we want it probably as much as everyone else does. Even though it doesn't have every other feature of every other platform, again, we are working very, very hard to get it out to a wider audience. And of course, the initial release is not the final release, as Jeff discussed in the keynote. We are always pushing forward. There will always be more cool new things. But we're excited just to get what's there out into people's hands. Now, one thing I was just recently asked again about plugin support for Android. So I do want to be clear and upfront that there isn't support for plugins in the initial release. But in the initial release, there is support for declares to both operating system and third-party libraries. So what that means is that someone like Christian could build an Android library, give you the set of declares that works, and away you go. You could use that. You could do that yourself. If there are things that Android provides that we don't, you can make declares into it, and we will ship several of those declare examples with the initial version of Android support. And of course, there are detailed items in the tester notes. If you haven't been testing, or if you've been testing without reading that document, please go read it. We spent a lot of time on it, and it goes through in detail and says, here's everything we can do, and here's everything we don't do, and it just makes all of that very clear and easy to understand. So, when, to the shock of no one here, probably the top question, bottom line, release plans. So, we don't give timelines because they're inherently unpredictable, but every day we're getting closer. As I mentioned, we're working really hard to fix bugs, and we've still got transpiler, framework, debugger bugs to fix before we go to a wider audience. In fact, I was talking with Jeremy about an hour ago. He gave me a project, said, I think this is showing a transcompiler bug, and I fixed it. And it's great, it'll be in the next pre-release. So we are working very, very hard, even here, while we are at the conference, to fix bugs and get us closer to shipping. And as I mentioned earlier, another key thing we want to do is improve compile times with some projects, because we know there are some projects out there that are taking a bit longer than we want to compile, and we're working hard to address that before we open up to a wider audience. And another thing that people don't often talk about, but we need to update the documentation to make it clear about what is and is not supported on Android, how to get things set up, how to get your app into the Google Play Store, that kind of thing. While we've started that process, there's a lot to update, and so we're going to have to get that ready for shipping. And finally, we need to fix up all the examples, make sure they work correctly, serve the purpose that we've designed them for, and get them ready to go, since we know that examples are one of the most common ways that people learn how to use Xojo. So, one other note, and I don't mean this to scare anyone, but the initial release is going to be tagged as a beta. And the reason why we're doing that is because we have this brand new compilation technique and system. We have this brand new debugging technique and system in addition to the framework. Typically when we add another platform or another 64-bit or another architecture to Xojo, a lot of the work, the compiler already exists, the debugger already exists, and a lot of the work is in the framework. Well, Android is very unique, and so we are shipping 3 major new things to make Android happen. And so we just want to be clear that we understand that there may be a few bumps in the road here and there, but on the other side of the coin, people are already making apps that they want in the Play Store, and so we want more and more people to be able to do that. So labeling something that is brand new with a lot of new stuff as beta is similar to what we've done in the past. If you've been with us for a while, we've done that several times with things like iOS and Cocoa. Just to clarify what is meant by beta, we are just saying it's a new platform with new documentation, new pieces that we know are new, and because they're new, they haven't seen every bit of user code that's out there. There are so many different projects that do things that we haven't even thought of, that people will run for the first time when we ship because they don't want to be a pre-release tester. That's great. But as they do that, they will find more edges and things for us to work out, and we will. Again, the most common areas of Xojo are working, the most common user interface controls, the most common framework pieces are all there and working. And as I've said, it is at the point where you can use it and ship apps to both devices and stores. So again, we're working very hard to deliver Android support. It's been a top focus for us for a while now. We really appreciate all of you here and at home who have been helping us test. It has been one of our longer testing cycles because of all the new pieces in it, so thank you for helping us make it better. And of course, we know how excited people are for this and to get Android versions of their apps out and into the world. So I intentionally tried to make my presentation about 30 minutes because I knew there would probably be a lot of questions. So I'll open it up now, and I'll answer the ones I can. Again, I can't tell you when because I honestly don't know, but we're working very, very hard to get it done. Yes?
Why is it that the controls sometimes jump around when we try to put them next to each other?
I don't know. The question was, why do the controls jump around when we try to put them next to each other? I could tell you why that might happen for iOS apps, but I don't see that happening very often on Android. So if that's happening in Android, please file an issue, because we want to fix that. That should not happen. Yes? Well, that's actually easier on Android than it is on iOS. So the question is, if I want to put this a Xojo-built app on Android devices without going through the Play Store or the Amazon store, how do I do it? Well, with Android, there is an option, and it varies depending on the device exactly where it is. But if you go into your settings on the device, you'll usually see it under debugging or development that says enable development mode and enable access from third-party sources. That's what you need to check, and it will say, are you sure you want to do this? This may reduce your device security, all the standard warnings and disclaimers that you might expect. But once you do that and check that box, you can literally use Xojo itself to put it on a device, debug on that device, or use any of Google's standard utilities to just drag and drop it. That you don't have to worry about a lot of the enterprise code signing stuff that you do for Apple platforms. So once the device has been cleared to run from third party, the world's your oyster. Away you go. Yes?
Is there a way
Okay, the question was, is there a way to get scroll bars when a window is long rather than just cutting it off? And Paul? Okay, Paul mentions that the answer should be a scrollable area. So if you haven't tried using a scrollable area, please try that on the current pre-release, and that should let you do it. And again, if it doesn't, this will be the theme: file an issue. Okay? Yes?
Can you elaborate some of the frustrations you saw with like the Fire TV devices and such?
The question was, can I elaborate some of the frustrations I saw with the Fire TV devices and such? Well, specifically, and I can probably go on about some of these things for an hour, but there's not really a ton of consistency in the Android world, first off. So one of the things you get from Apple is at least more consistency throughout iOS and macOS and how they work together. So FireOS, like I mentioned, that is what runs these Amazon devices, is actually, you know, a branch from the Android open source project. So like Chrome, the web browser, has Chromium, the open source project. Android, the operating system, has the Android open source project, where anyone can grab that and run and build an operating system. That's exactly what Amazon has done with FireOS. But that means all the menus are different, things are in different places, a preference with wording that is similar that you would expect to mean the same thing on a Fire device versus a Google Pixel device is actually different. That gets frustrating. The option to enable third-party applications on a Fire TV, I believe in an earlier version was actually called Allow All Applications, which isn't necessarily clear that that's what you need to check to allow an app to install that wasn't from a store, but that's what they meant by that. So I would say most of the frustrations with the other devices are just because Android is so free and used out there on so many different devices and chipsets that there's a lot of different things that you may have to learn with each kind of device and each way they've chosen to customize it. So that's probably the biggest thing. Oh yeah, no, what I was testing, to be clear, on all those different devices I showed, I was testing our Cats Up example, and it showed the cats on a nice 70-inch TV. I was pretty thrilled. It worked. And before someone asks, when I mentioned Android TV, someone would ask, well, what about Apple TV? Well, the Apple stuff works entirely different in the sense that the app model, the framework, and controls are completely different on something like a watch or a TV, whereas with Android, you can literally take the same executable and run it on an Android TV or Fire TV. So it's a very different approach that has its pros and cons, but that's why you're able to just put it on a Chromecast and have it work.
You mentioned it.
Yes?
Are you guys thinking of building something for the Apple TV?
So the question, which was a bit off topic, is, are you thinking about building something for the Apple TV? And while that wasn't in the public roadmap, I mean, we're always thinking of things. And, you know, our CEO has an Apple TV. I have an Apple TV. So I would certainly, I never want to say no to that, but I do have to say it's not on our roadmap. We know how we would approach it. So if it bubbles up, yeah, I mean, personally, it would be interesting to me because I have one, but it's not currently on the roadmap. Yes?
Google are quite aggressive with their specifications for uploading new apps to the Play Store, and they tend to, well, we're on API 31 now, we're going to be API 32 next month. How I mean, that probably goes faster than the traditional Xojo release cycles go. How are you going to keep up once you jump in the water?
Well, so the question was, the Google Play Store requirements, they require a certain target SDK level. There are actually two different numbers that are important with the Google Play Store. There's the required SDK level, and then there's the target level. Now, the target level actually, that doesn't change more often than we release. We typically release, as all of you well know, 3 to 4 times a year. That is more than enough to stick with their ironclad requirements. In fact, ever since we've been testing, we keep a couple of our apps in the Play Store just to know that we are updating fast enough and that that's okay. So it's been in the back of our minds, but so far, so good. We're feeling pretty confident about that. Okay, yeah, Christian.
What about your internal plugins, like visualizations, XML? Will you do next year something, maybe the bridge to
Okay,
use them in Z code, or will you go wide?
so I am shocked to say that Christian asked, what about plugins and what about our internal plugins, like regular expressions and XML, and will those be coming? And things like Xojo script. So let me tackle the first part of that question first. Our own internal plugins like regex and XML, I don't necessarily want to commit to those being the same type of plugin in Android. But from a usability perspective, those functions would likely appear sooner than later because we know people use them. But I won't necessarily say they will be the same plugin that is used on the other platforms. They may be OS calls or other third-party libraries. Related to that question was, will some kind of bridge exist? So plugins built in our current plugin SDK, will there be a similar way to do it in the near future? And I can't commit to timelines, but boy, we all know how valuable your plugins are to the community, Christian, and we'll be in touch certainly. But that's about all I can say, because I really, really do want things like extensibility and plugins to be a part of Android sooner than later, but that's about all I can say right now. Yeah?
Sorry if this is a dumb question, but
Oh, no.
you're targeting phones first, but it can run on a Chromebook per se. Is it going to look like the phone, like on the screen, or is it going to be spread out and look all crappy?
So the question is that we mentioned we're supporting phones in the initial release, but I also talked about how technically they run on these other platforms. And what's that experience like? Well, I can tell you, since I just recently did it. So it makes a lot of difference in how your application is designed into how it would work on something like a big screen TV from a phone. If you are fairly careful about the way you program your app and anticipate that your screen may have dimensions of something as small as 300 by 200 all the way up to 2,000 by 3,000, you're going to be just fine. In fact, with our catsup example, I realized that we made some assumptions about size there that I had to change. But I think it was 2 lines of code, and I had the entire TV screen filled with a picture of a cat, which was the goal. And it looked correct. Now, with that said, making a proper, what they call, 10-foot interface for the TV is separate work. So you're not just going to want to take a phone app and release it for TV without doing some extra detection that says, am I on a TV? And if I am, I probably want some big buttons here, so when I use the remote to go down, which is the equivalent of the tab key on a keyboard, or a touch of a button on a touch screen, that it works and is a good experience. So I will say, technically it's possible, but there is user interface work that you'll need to do. But a lot of it is actually possible in Xojo Android support today. Although again, I do want to say that we are absolutely focused on phones first, just because that's where most of the demand is. But you can do it if you're willing to put in the work. Yes?
Is there going to be any Pragma calls so that we know the device that we're operating on?
So the question is, are there going to be Pragma calls so you know the device that you're running in? Well, that is also a bit of a loaded question, because there's not a great call that just says, what kind of device am I beyond? I think there are some standard ones like TV, tablet, phone. And you can get those fairly easily today with a simple declare. But of course, as I mentioned, the system data class is coming, which gives you the version and date and build number of the operating system itself. You can look at your screen object to know its dimensions, but there isn't really a call that I know of that will specifically say I am on phone brand ABC.
It's all common. It's all common.
Right, right. I mean, really the bottom line is, he said, so maybe there's not really a need for a Pragma because we're taking this trans-compilation approach. And in most cases, yes, that's true. Yeah, Jeremy.
Earlier, when you made the example project for the desktop web,
Yes.
could you have copied the iOS logo screen, pasted it in the project?
So the question was, he noticed in my demo about sharing code that I copied and pasted the code, but could I have copied the actual screen from iOS and pasted it into Android? And the answer is right now, no. But sounds like an interesting thing, doesn't it, Xojo team? So we would love for that to happen. And in fact, I mean, we've talked about that very, very thing.
It actually just tries, and it does run, but the buttons, I can click them.
No, it is not meant to, and perhaps we should block that until it works the way that it is supposed to. I'll put it that way. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any plans on supporting in-app purchase?
So the question is, do we have any plans to support in-app purchase? And yes, we do, but I will say I've already tested declares to support in-app purchase, and they work for me on the test setup. I, of course, haven't gone to the production setup where I'm actually billing someone yet, but I can talk to you about that later because I've actually played with that.
So is it something you would be able to share with me?
Yes, yes. So the follow-up question was, is that something I'd be able to share? And yes, in fact, I'm trying to make an example that includes the basics of in-app purchase just to ship with the product. Yes.
How exactly do you do an include like that? 'Cause I'm actually was going to ask the same question.
So the question was, how do you actually do an include like that? Well, the declare statements are actually very, very similar to the other platforms. And in fact, I think the current example that's shipped with the test version is rather rudimentary. But we actually have a brand new declare engine for Android that is coming soon. I think I mentioned it earlier in the presentation, that enables all kinds of things like changing the property of a control, calling not only an operating system declare, but a declare in a third-party Android library. So we know declares are and extensibility are very important, and so that's intended to be there in the initial release. Yes, great. Okay, yeah.
Which is a bit more the combination of iOS and Android.
Mm-hmm.
Having built plenty of apps of both, I can't really imagine now building one where I didn't need some kind of WebSocket. Is there any plan to have WebSocket support in Xojo, so you can open a WebSocket to a WebSocket server and without having to, I know Ken's done an excellent job of coding one in Xojo, but something important enough for you to think about having
So the question is, what do we think about adding native WebSocket support to both, presumably, iOS and Android? And yes, we've talked about it, and in fact, it might make sense to extend URL connection to be able to do that. Is it important enough is always a question of priority. I'm sure you've probably made an issue about it that can get voted on, but if you haven't, please do. Yeah, no, even if it was a while ago, go in and thumbs up it because we're looking at that all the time. But I do understand why you would want WebSocket. I think a lot of people are already getting a lot done just with URL connection, but I do know why you want that, and I hear you.
It could be something that you even add into the website as well, so if you
Yes.
Xojo web backend to your app.
Yeah. So the follow-up comment was just, it would be great if we also answered the server side of that equation too, and I agree. Yes. Okay, anything else? Okay, thanks everybody.